Chapter 2. Abraham Lincoln's 13 Years in Indiana. Early in the autumn of 1816, the Lincoln family, bidding adieu to their old Kentucky home, commenced a long and wearisome journey toward the forests of southern Indiana. The plain wagon, with its simple covering, contained the household goods, and sheltered the wife and daughter, while the father and his son, who was now in his 9th year, walked beside the horse which steadily drew the family conveyance, or took care that the indispensable cow kept pace to the music of the jolting wheels. Arriving at the proper landing on the banks of the Ohio, the little caravan was embarked upon a flatboat and floated across the stream, now swelled to fair proportions by the autumn rains. Finally reaching the Indiana side, the adventurers landed at or near the mouth of Anderson's Creek, now the boundary between the counties of Perry and Spencer, about 140 miles below Louisville by the river and 60 above Evansville. In a direct line across the country from their former residence, the distance is perhaps hardly 100 miles, yet the journey had occupied them a whole week. The place where Mr. Lincoln settled at the end of his journey was near the present town of Gentryville, some distance back from the Ohio River, and was under the earliest organizations in Perry County. 2 years later, however, Spencer County was formed, embracing all that part of Perry west of Anderson's Creek and including the place of Mr. Lincoln's location. Here, then, his emigrant wagon paused, and soon, with the help of his youthful son, a log cabin was built, which was to be their rough but comfortable home for many coming years. This done, and a shelter provided for their cattle, the next work was to clear an opening in the forest upon which to raise a crop of grain for their sustenance during the next season. Hard work had now begun in good earnest for the young Kentuckian, and the realities of genuine pioneer life were to be brought home to his comprehension in a very practical manner. Indiana, at this date, was still a territory, having been originally united under the same government with Illinois after the admission of Ohio as a state, the firstborn of the great Northwest, in 1802. A separate territorial organization was made for each in 1809. In June 1816, pursuant to a Congressional Enabling Act, a convention had been held which adopted a state constitution, preparatory to admission into the Union, and under this constitution, a month or two after Thomas Lincoln's arrival in December 1816, Indiana became, by act of Congress, a sovereign state. Its population at this time was about 65,000, distributed chiefly south of a straight line drawn from Vincennes on the Wabash to Lawrenceburg on the Ohio. The next 13 years Abraham Lincoln spent here in southern Indiana near the Ohio, nearly midway between Louisville and Evansville. He was now old enough to begin to take an active part in the farm labors of his father, and he manfully performed his share of hard work. He learned to use the axe and to hold the plow. He became inured to all the duties of seed time and harvest. On many a day during every one of those 13 years, this Kentucky boy might have been seen with a long gad in his hand, driving his father's team in the field, or from the woods with a heavy draught, or on the rough path to the mill, the store, or the river landing. Very probably at times, in the language of the Hoosier bard, descriptive of such pioneer workers in general, sans shoes or socks on, with snake pole and a yoke of oxen. A vigorous constitution and a cheerful, unrepining disposition made all his labors comparatively light. To such a one, this sort of life has in it much of pleasant excitement to compensate for its hardships. He learned to derive enjoyment from the severest lot. The dignity of labor, which is with demagogues such hollow cant, became to him a true and appreciable reality. Thus, by hearty outdoor labor and exercise, he laid the foundation of that iron constitution which proved such a blessing throughout his whole life, enabling him to endure fatigue and care to which an ordinary frame would have succumbed. About this time also he took a start as a hunter, which was never much improved afterward. One day, toward the close of his 8th year, while his father happened to be absent, a flock of wild turkeys approached the cabin, and Abraham, standing inside, took aim with a rifle through a crevice of the log house and succeeded in killing one of the fowls. This was his first shot at living game, and, according to his own account, he has never since pulled a trigger on larger, but we can imagine and participate in the pride with which he exhibited his trophy to his delighted parents. In the autumn of 1818, Abraham had the misfortune to lose his excellent mother. She was a truly noble woman, as her son's life attested. From her came that deep and abiding reverence for holy things, that profound trust in providence and faith in the triumph of truth, and that gentleness and amiability of temper which, in the lofty station of chief magistrate, he displayed so strikingly during years of most appalling responsibility. From her he derived the spirit of humor and the desire to see others happy, which afterward formed so prominent a trait in his character. Though uneducated in books, she was wise in the wisdom of experience and truth, and was to her son a faithful mentor as well as a good mother. He never ceased to mourn her loss and ever cherished her memory with the tenderest affection and respect. A year after her death, his father married Mrs. Sally Johnson at Elizabethtown, Kentucky, a widow, with 3 children by her first marriage. She proved a good and kind mother to Abraham, and has lived to see him occupying the chief position in the land and in the hearts of his countrymen. There were no children by this second marriage. Here, during his residence in Evansville, Mr. Lincoln's education may properly be said to have commenced. It is true that the schools of his neighborhood were of the same class and little better than those in Kentucky, yet, aided by what he had already acquired, he managed to increase his slender stock of learning. His teachers, while here, were Andrew Crawford, Sweeney, and Azel W. Dorsey, the latter of whom has lived to see his whilom pupil a giant leader among the people. Abraham had achieved the art of reading before his own mother's death, and subsequently, by the assistance of a young man of the neighborhood, had learned to write, an accomplishment which some of the friendly neighbors thought unnecessary, but his father quietly persisted, and the boy was set down as a prodigy when he wrote to an old friend of his mother's, a traveling preacher, and begged him to come and preach a sermon over his mother's grave. 3 months after, Parson Elkins came, and friends assembled, a year after her death, to pay a last tribute of respect to one universally beloved and respected. Her son's share in securing the presence of the clergyman was not unmentioned, and Abraham soon found himself called upon to write letters for his neighbors. So, when Mr. Crawford came into the vicinity and at the solicitation of the people of the settlement opened a school in his own cabin, Abraham's father embraced the opportunity to send him in order that he might add some knowledge of arithmetic to his reading and writing. With buckskin clothes, a raccoon-skin cap, and an old arithmetic which had been somewhere found for him, he commenced his studies in the higher branches. His progress was rapid, and his perseverance and faithfulness won the interest and esteem of his teacher. Probably the most interesting period in the biography of a great man, be he student, statesman, or soldier, is when the desire of honor first touches his heartstrings, and when the first little sip at the fountain of knowledge has developed a thirst which would drink deeply and forever. For it is at this critical moment, that of the charming yet dangerous first draught, that we seem to behold the germ, the incipient dawn, as it were, of those after-deeds which are to shed lustre upon the man's life, and upon the world in which he lives and acts. Our curiosity is awakened to learn what were his first loves in the way of books, human characters, and the visible objects of the natural universe. For, knowing these, it is a pleasure to look back upon and compare them with our own experiences, or with the similar characteristics of those who have been numbered among the world's great men. In spite, however, of his father's care to give him every facility for the acquirement of an education which was within his reach, as well as of his own assiduity and thirst for knowledge, little Abraham's opportunities must have been extremely limited, for he was accustomed to say in after life that he thought the aggregate of all his schooling did not amount to 1 year. He was never in a college or academy as a student, and never inside a college or academy till since he had a law license, and what he had in the way of education was picked up in his own way. After he was 23 and had separated from his father, he studied English grammar, imperfectly of course, but so as to speak and write as well as he did. He studied and nearly mastered the 6 books of Euclid after he arrived at manhood. In this connection, we may be permitted to quote the following interesting narrative concerning Mr. Lincoln's education and early experiences, as elicited for him by the Reverend J.P. Gulliver during a lengthy personal interview. It is especially valuable as throwing more light upon the President's peculiar mental constitution than we have found elsewhere. I want very much to know, Mr. Lincoln, how you got this unusual power of putting things. It must have been a matter of education. No man has it by nature alone. What has your education been? Well, as to education, the newspapers are correct. I never went to school more than 12 months in my life, but as you say, this must be a product of culture in some form. I have been putting the question you ask me to myself while you have been talking. I can say this, that among my earliest recollections, I remember how, when a mere child, I used to get irritated when anybody talked to me in a way I could not understand. I don't think I ever got angry at anything else in my life, but that always disturbed my temper, and has ever since. I can remember going to my little bedroom after hearing the neighbors talk of an evening with my father, and spending no small part of the night walking up and down and trying to make out what was the exact meaning of some of their, to me, dark sayings. I could not sleep, though I often tried to, when I got on such a hunt after an idea until I had caught it. And when I thought I had got it, I was not satisfied until I had repeated it over and over, until I had put it in language plain enough, as I thought, for any boy I knew to comprehend. This was a kind of passion with me, and it has since stuck by me. For I am never easy now when I am handling a thought till I have bounded it north and bounded it south and bounded it east and bounded it west. Perhaps that accounts for the characteristic you observe in my speeches, though I never put the things together before. Mr. Lincoln, I thank you for this. It is the most splendid educational fact I ever happened upon. This is genius, with all its impulsive, inspiring, dominating power over the mind of its possessor, developed by education into talent, with its uniformity, its permanence, and its disciplined strength, always ready, always available, never capricious, the highest possession of the human intellect. But let me ask, did you not have a law education? How did you prepare for your profession? Oh yes, I read law, as the phrase is. That is, I became a lawyer's clerk in Springfield, and copied tedious documents, and picked up what I could of law in the intervals of other work. But your question reminds me of a bit of education I had, which I am bound in honesty to mention. In the course of my law reading, I constantly came upon the word demonstrate. I thought at first that I understood its meaning, but soon became satisfied that I did not. I said to myself, what do I mean when I demonstrate more than when I reason or prove? How does demonstration differ from any other proof? I consulted Webster's dictionary. That told of certain proof beyond the possibility of doubt, but I could form no idea what sort of proof that was. I thought a great many things were proved beyond a possibility of doubt without recourse to any such extraordinary process of reasoning as I understood demonstration to be. I consulted all the dictionaries and books of reference I could find, but with no better results. You might as well have defined blue to a blind man. At last I said, Lincoln, you can never make a lawyer if you do not understand what demonstrate means. And I left my situation in Springfield, went home to my father's house, and stayed there till I could give any propositions in the 6 books of Euclid at sight. I then found out what demonstrate means and went back to my law studies. I could not refrain from saying, in my admiration of such a development of character and genius combined, Mr. Lincoln, your success is no longer a marvel. It is the legitimate result of adequate causes. You deserve it all, and a great deal more. If you will permit me, I would like to use this fact publicly. It will be most valuable in inciting our young men to that patient classical and mathematical culture which most minds absolutely require. No man can talk well unless he is able, first of all, to define to himself what he is talking about. Euclid, well studied, would free the world of half its calamities by banishing half the nonsense which now deludes and curses it. I have often thought that Euclid would be one of the best books to put on the catalogue of the Tract Society if they could only get people to read it. It would be a means of grace. I think so, said he, laughing. I vote for Euclid. Books, of course, were his great delight, and the procuring of a sufficient number of them to employ his mind one of his principal anxieties. In this his father did much to aid him, and whenever he heard of any particular volume which he thought desirable, or for which Abraham asked, he always endeavoured to obtain it for the use of his son. His teacher, Mr. Crawford, also frequently loaned him books which he could not otherwise have procured. In this way he became acquainted with Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, A Life of Henry Clay, and Wemyss's Life of Washington. The hatchet story of Washington, which has probably done more to make boys truthful than 100 solemn exhortations, made a strong impression upon Abraham, and was undoubtedly one of those unseen gentle influences which helped to form his character for integrity and honesty. Its effect may be traced in the following story, which bids fair to become as never-failing an accompaniment to A Life of Lincoln as the hatchet story is to that of Washington. Mr. Crawford had lent him a copy of Ramsay's Life of Washington, the only copy known to be in existence in the neighborhood. Before he had finished reading the book, it was left one night by a not unnatural oversight in a window, and the next morning it was found to be soaked through with water. The wind had changed, the rain had beaten in through a crack in the logs, and the book was ruined. How could he face the owner under such circumstances? He had no money to offer as a return, but he took the book, went directly to Mr. Crawford, showed him the irreparable injury, and frankly and honestly offered to work for him until he should be satisfied. "Well, Abe," said Crawford, "as it's you, I won't be hard on you. Come over and pull fodder for me for 2 days, and we will call our accounts even." The offer was accepted, and the engagement literally fulfilled. The book was, of course, worth the labor, and there is therefore nothing to be admired in the way of generosity, but the honorable part of the incident lies in the quick acknowledgment of the injury Abraham had caused to the book, and the eagerness he displayed to furnish its owner an equivalent for its value. It was simply characteristic of the honorable conscientiousness, integrity, and industry which so distinguished him in after life. At the age of 19, Abraham, then a full-grown, active, and intelligent young man, was permitted to see more of the world, and made a trip down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans as one of the hands on a flatboat. The excursion, while it gratified the love of adventure natural to his years, undoubtedly added to his stock of useful information, and served in no slight degree to develop that spirit of intelligent observation and self-reliance which contributed so much to his subsequent success in life. In concluding this sketch of the 13 important years spent by Mr. Lincoln as an Indianian, we cannot refrain from presenting to our readers the following graphic personal recollections of a distinguished lawyer who emigrated to that state about the same time, inasmuch as they will naturally aid in conveying a correct impression of those times, as well as of the circumstances with which Lincoln's youth was surrounded. Indiana was born in the year 1816, with some 65,000 inhabitants only about 40 years ago. A few counties only were then organized. The whole middle, north, and northwest portions of the state were an unbroken wilderness in the possession of the Indians. Well do I remember when there were but 2 families settled west of the Whitewater Valley, one at Flat Rock, above where Rushville now stands, and the other on Brandywine, near where Greenfield was afterwards located. When I first visited the ground on which Indianapolis now stands, the whole country east to Whitewater and west to the Wabash was a dense, unbroken forest. There were no public roads, no bridges over any of the streams. The traveler had literally to swim his way. No cultivated farms, no houses to shelter or feed the weary traveler or his jaded horse. The courts, years afterward, were held in log huts, and the jury sat under the shade of the forest trees. I was circuit prosecuting attorney at the time of the trials at the Falls of Fall Creek, where Pendleton now stands. 4 of the prisoners were convicted of murder, and 3 of them hung for killing Indians. The court was held in a double log cabin. The grand jury sat upon a log in the woods, and the foreman signed the bills of indictment which I had prepared upon his knee. There was not a petit juror that had shoes on. All wore moccasins and were belted around the waist and carried side knives used by the hunter. The products of the country consisted of peltries, the wild game killed in the forest by the Indian hunters, the fish caught in the interior lakes, rivers, and creeks, the pawpaw, wild plum, haws, small berries gathered by the squaws in the woods. The travel was confined to the single horse and his rider, the commerce to the pack saddle, and the navigation to the Indian canoe. Many a time and oft have I crossed our swollen streams by day and by night, sometimes swimming my horse, and at others paddling the rude bark canoe of the Indian. Such is a mere sketch of our state when I traversed its wilds, and I am not one of its first settlers. Amid such scenes, and in this rough but natural state of society, young Lincoln reached the verge of manhood, with a strong and muscular frame, a rugged constitution, a frank and courteous heart and demeanor, and a character conspicuous for honesty and energy. Indeed, if we may believe the statements of those who knew him at this early period, this stalwart stripling, who even then stood nearly 6 feet and 4 inches high, was no less remarkable for his mental and moral characteristics than for his physical proportions. Already, albeit unknown to himself and unsuspected by others, the training of that rough experience through which he was passing was insensibly, but no less surely, molding both body and mind into perfect fitness for the high and noble destiny which awaited him in the future. God had set him apart for a special work upon this earth, a work full of importance, not to himself alone, but to his country, to humanity itself, and, looking at his now perfectly completed life, we can see how, step by step, every phase of his varied experience was made subservient to his proper preparation for that work.